Library. A quick note before we start. This session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with the link to it on our site at ICSS Marx within the next few days. In fact, we would like to wish everyone a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because we have program attendees now from throughout the United States and even around the world. My name is Alan Miller and I will be hosting this meeting. I'm a member of the program committee that organizes the Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library, and I would like to start off by saying that we always welcome input, feedback, suggestions for topics and speakers. You can contact us through our website at icssmarx.org. For over a decade and a half, I think it's 16 years now, Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library has been a platform for presentations on a variety of topics such as political economy, capitalism, socialism, communism, supporting the struggles of the working class, the fight against imperialism, militarism, war, the environmental movement, and the fight for racial and gender justice. In pre-pandemic times, our weekly program was hosted at the Niebyl-Proctor Marxist Library located in Oakland, California, USA. And since the pandemic, we've been meeting on Zoom every Sunday morning. The program is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. The opinions expressed are those of the participants. They do not necessarily represent those of the ICSS or the Marxist Library. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Karl Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." We have a very special program today. Our program speaker today is Maupin, who is an RT correspondent, a widely acclaimed speaker, writer, journalist, and political analyst. Caleb has traveled extensively in the Middle East and in Latin America. He was involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement from its early planning stages and has been involved in many struggles for social justice. He's an outspoken advocate of international friendship and cooperation, as well as 21st century socialism. In order to learn more about Caleb, you can go to his website at www.calebmaupin.com and also the Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. We'll start off with a presentation by Caleb. Following that, we'll have a short break for announcements, followed by Q&A from the audience. So write down your questions as he's speaking. Pop them in the chat if you want. We'll call on you after when we get to the Q&A session. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Caleb to do his presentation.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. It's very much an honor to speak to a group based in Oakland, California. Many times, labor historians will reference the great general strikes of the USA, Seattle in 1919, San Francisco and Minneapolis in 1934. But many will forget that Oakland had a general strike in 1946 as part of the post-war strike wave. And we know that when the House Un-American Activities Committee came to the Bay Area, it was activists in Oakland who shut it down and shocked the country. I think a propaganda film was even made, Operation Abolition, showing how effectively the progressive community of Oakland, California had countered the House Un-American Activities Committee in their witch hunts. And we know Oakland is where the Black Panthers originated, and they inspired the world. And the whole world was kind of watching the Bay Area, Ramparts magazine during the 1960s. But even more recently, the Bay Area, and Oakland in particular, have very big achievements. You know, as was mentioned in my introduction, I was part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And during the Occupy movement back in 2011, everybody knew that Oakland was the most radical and the most communist Occupy. That was where we had Boots Riley, right? And that's where some police repression was rained down. There was a veteran who was struck in the head with a tear gas canister. And in response to that, you had yet another general strike. The city of Oakland shut down in opposition to police repression of the Occupy protests. I had the opportunity to be out in Oakland in the aftermath of Donald Trump's election and be on the streets with some of the anarchists and some of the progressive folks who took to the streets. I also got to go to UC Berkeley when some of the confrontations were happening and cover that as a reporter. So I have great admiration for what the progressive folks of the Bay Area and of Oakland in particular have done over the years. I believe you all are home to the International Longshore Warehouse Union, which is one of the most progressive and internationalist labor unions in the United States. I think the most progressive and internationalist labor union that shut down the docks to protest the war in Iraq, that refused to unload ships from apartheid South Africa. So I thank you for this great invitation. Now, Marxism is one of the most important and the most important ideology in human history. And what separates Marxism from other schools of thought, other ideologies and worldviews that have developed, is that Marxism does not view itself as eternal. Rather, it views nothing as eternal. The best articulation I've ever heard of the Marxist understanding of human history and reality is the formula A does not equal A. And it was put forward by many explaining Marxism. A does not equal A, meaning that that first A can never be the same as the second A, because all things are constantly in a state of motion and change. The world is never the same, and all that exists is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of motion. We know of the concept of the dialectic that was used by Hegel and others, that first you have a thesis, and then that thesis is met with an antithesis, and then the thesis and the antithesis clash, and the result is a synthesis. But then that synthesis becomes yet again a new thesis, and that thesis is once again met with an antithesis, and once again they clash, resulting in yet another synthesis, and that this is the process through which change occurs. And the world is constantly in a state of change. The world is constantly in a state of motion. Nothing is solid. All that is solid melts into air. This is the Marxist worldview. And unlike previous worldviews, unlike previous perspectives, it does not view the nature of the world as it currently exists as being eternal. Rather, it understands that all things are in a state of change. Now, Friedrich Engels, in his important essay, The Role of Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, noted that there is something special about human beings. Human beings are tool makers, and unlike other animals, human beings, they not only interact with their environment, but they force their environment to serve them. They force the environment to serve them, and they master it. And that this distinction is the final distinction which separates human beings from the rest of the animal kingdom. And that human beings are constantly reinventing the way that they interact with their environment. Beavers have been building their beaver dams the same way for millions of years. Ants have been making their ant farms the same way for millions of years. But in just a few thousand years, human beings have gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods to space travel and iPhones, and huge skyscraper buildings and artificial intelligence. And that this ability to constantly reinvent the way we interact with our environment is what defines the human species. Human beings are not, necessarily stronger than other animals. Human beings are not necessarily, more enduring than other animals. But this ability to be creative and reinvent the nature of our collective existence, that is what defines human beings and makes them distinct from the rest of the animal kingdom. And Marxism is founded on that understanding. It's founded on the understanding that as human beings move ahead, that new modes of production are developed as we change the way we interact with our environment. And those new modes of production necessitate new political and social relations that emerge. And that there is a constant march forward toward a higher and more efficient mode of production, toward a better state of being, toward a higher population on the planet, toward a higher and more comfortable means of existence and a higher life expectancy. That humans are constantly advancing and marching forward, getting toward a higher plane of existence, a higher mode of production, and a higher level of abundance. And the problem with capitalism is that, unlike systems of the past, in systems of the past, people were hungry because there wasn't enough food. But under capitalism, people are hungry because there is too much food. In systems of the past, people were homeless because there was a shortage of housing. But under capitalism, people are homeless because there's too much housing. And that under capitalism, technological progress and the advancement of the productive forces leads to greater poverty. The more efficient the means of production become, the poorer people get. The workers are left outcast and starving amid the wonders that they have made. And as a result, millions are left hungry and desperate, and we have a situation where human technological progress is not advancing the species, but rather leading to greater poverty. And so the only solution to that is for the workers and the broad masses of people to seize control of the centers of economic power. The banks and the factories and the centers of economic power need to not be operated to make profits for a small group of owners, but instead, the means of production need to be rationally planned and organized on behalf of all of society. And in doing so, this problem of abundance creating poverty amid plenty, can be abolished. And with a centrally planned economy and rational control of the means of production, living standards can increase, and we can get to a yet higher mode of existence. And the goal is to get to a world of so much abundance and so much prosperity that the very need for a state or a government can fade away, that all social inequality and hierarchies can fade away, and we can have a society based on each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. That is the ultimate goal, and it's possible if human beings can get beyond the irrationality of the market and profits in command and get to a centrally planned economy where growth and technological progress do not result in poverty but benefit all society, and the artificial restraints on human creativity and human progress imposed by the profit system can be lifted. And that is the science of revolution. Marxists are constantly wrangling with how is it that we can achieve this goal of having society come together and take control of the means of production. And Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the revolutionary movement in Russia, he stepped into the revolutionary movement in 1903 with a groundbreaking polemic, a very important book called What Is to Be Done. And in his book, What Is to Be Done, Vladimir Lenin vehemently criticized the Russian Marxist movement. He was saying, if we want to win, if we actually want to overthrow the Tsarist autocracy and establish a workers' and peasants' government in Russia, we have to start operating differently. He said if the situation changes in 24 hours, then the tactics must also change in 24 hours. Because A does not equal A, and all that is solid melts into air. And essentially, what Vladimir Lenin was calling for in his very famous polemic, What Is to Be Done, he was calling for political innovation. He was saying that the old ways of doing things, the tailism, the bowing to spontaneity, the economism, had to be chucked. And instead, they needed to form a party of new type, based on democratic centralism, that would engage in agitation and propaganda, and that by building this organization of cadres who would give the whole of their lives to the revolutionary movement, by organizing with methods of democratic centralism, agitation, and propaganda, they could eventually take power in Russia. And it was because of that moment in 1903 where the Russian revolutionary movement drastically switched its tactics that you had the uprising of 1905, where you had the Tsar who shot down the workers in front of the Winter Palace. Then you had strikes taking place across Russia, and what was initially a spontaneous uprising against hunger and political repression turned into an almost revolutionary situation in 1905. And then in 1917, amid World War I, you had yet another revolutionary crisis. And after the Tsar was toppled, you had Lenin returning from exile in April of 1917. And once again, Lenin says if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. And he puts forward his famous April thesis. and says we are approaching a revolutionary situation. We could actually win. We could actually take power. But in order to do that, we have to drastically change the way that we are operating. We cannot continue to function in the old way. We must drastically adjust our tactics. And when Lenin returned in April of 1917, the Bolsheviks rapidly changed the way that they were operating in order to take power, which they ultimately did. You had the July days and the strikes. You had the people of Russia opposing World War I and continuing to fight in World War I. You had the Kornilov reaction, where a military general tried to topple the provisional government, and then ultimately in October you had the victory of the Soviet government and the establishment of Soviet Russia, which eventually became the Soviet Union. But if the Bolsheviks had just continued to operate in the old way, if they had continued to habitually follow the way the Marxist movement was operating in 1903, this never would have happened. It required political innovation. It required turning around and changing tactics in order to take power, in order to win. And there's a very similar situation that took place in the lead up to the Chinese Revolution. One of the most important essays of Mao Zedong was written in 1927. And it was published, it was his report on an investigation into the peasant uprisings in Hunan. Mao Zedong was from a middle-class peasant family, and he was sent to Hunan, this province of China, where the peasantry were in revolt. And he came back from Hunan, and he wrote this essay, this very famous essay, that a lot of famous quotations from Mao come from. The essay is really a burning polemic against his own party. He is calling out the Chinese Communist Party for not embracing the peasant uprisings. The attitude in the Chinese Communist Party was that the peasantry were inherently backward, that the peasantry did not have revolutionary potential, they were illiterate, they were ignorant, they were barbaric, and Mao writes back in a fury. And he writes, "In a very short time, in China's central, southern, and northern provinces, several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back. They will smash all the trammels that bind them and rush forward on the road to liberation. They will sweep all the imperialists, warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil gentry into their graves. Every revolutionary party and every revolutionary comrade will be put to the test, to be accepted or rejected as they decide. There are three alternatives: to march at their head and lead them, to trail behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or to stand in their way and oppose them. Every Chinese is free to choose, but events will force them to choose quickly." It's that famous essay, this famous polemic by Mao Zedong, urging the Chinese Communist Party to embrace the peasant uprisings, where the also famous quote from Mao Zedong, where he says, "A single spark can light a prairie fire." That comes from this essay as well. And what this essay was Mao Zedong calling out the Chinese Communist Party and saying there is an explosion going on. And it's not coming from the factory workers in the cities, and it's not coming from the KMT nationalist movement. The revolutionary energy in China is in the countryside. It's in the people who have been held down by feudalism. They are ready to explode. And if we don't get our act together, and if we don't become the tribune of the people and embed ourselves with this explosion coming from the countryside, we're going to be left behind. And he's saying that with almost burning anger, because it's so obvious to Mao that this is where the revolution is going to come from. But yet it seems to be something that the Chinese Communist Party is not willing to embrace. And really it's only because of a change in history that Mao prevailed. It's because of the fact that Chiang Kai-shek turned against the Chinese Communist Party. After the death of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, you had the rise of Chiang Kai-shek as the leader of the KMT nationalist movement, and Chiang Kai-shek believed the Chinese Communist Party were his enemies. And so in 1927 you had a widespread slaughter of the communists in the cities, in Canton and Shanghai and elsewhere, and so the communists were forced to retreat to the countryside. And in the countryside, Mao Zedong and Chu Tai and others adopted their famous strategy of waging people's war, and it's because the communists were forced out of the cities and forced into the countryside that Mao Zedong and his strategy of organizing the peasantry ultimately prevailed, and the Chinese Revolution was victorious. And it was 25 years of civil war before the Chinese Revolution was victorious. It was, organizing a peasant uprising against the government and against the KMT. It was then organizing resistance against the Japanese invaders in a united front. And then after the Second World War, after Japan had been driven out of China, attempting to have a unified government with KMT and Chiang Kai-shek, and being rejected, being threatened with forcible disarmament, that ultimately the Civil War began once again, and then the People's Republic was declared on the mainland in 1949, and China embarked on the road it's on today. China is now the second largest economy in the world. At this point, 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty in China. What was once one of the poorest countries on earth is now a global industrial superpower, and it's raising people out of poverty all across the planet, building infrastructure in Africa, in parts of Asia that have been historically impoverished. The Belt and Road Initiative is really changing the world. And this all started with Mao Zedong and his willingness to change tactics, his willingness to say that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours, that A does not equal A, and all that is solid melts into air, his willingness to engage in political innovation. This precedes every great revolutionary movement. You want to look at the Cuban Revolution. You want to look at the Sandinista Revolution of Nicaragua. You want to look at what's going on in many countries around the world. Every great revolution is preceded by a dramatic shift in tactics. A voice comes along, and often it's a voice that seems like it's crying out in the wilderness, and comes along and says that if we want to win this thing, we've got to change how we're operating. If we want to win this thing, we need to stop functioning in the old way. If we're going to win this thing, we have to get serious. You can look at that in every revolution that's begun. I often point to the Bolivarian Revolution of Latin America. Right? During the Cold War, the primary way the United States maintained its dominion of South and Central America and beat back any potential revolution was by establishing military juntas, military dictatorships like Pinochet in Chile, various regimes in Argentina and Venezuela. You had Somoza in Nicaragua and elsewhere. They had these military strongmen who would crush any communist movement, crush any labor movement. And so as a result of that, in Latin America, communists were forced to flee to the countryside. And you had the rise of Che Guevara and his tactical methods, Focoism, organizing the peasantry in the countryside, waging guerrilla warfare. And that was successful in Nicaragua, that was successful in Cuba, it was successful in other parts of the region. But as the Cold War was coming to an end, and as the Soviet Union was, falling and becoming weaker, as Cuba was facing a special period, things started to change. The U.S. imperialists started changing how they dominated Latin America because of the fact that military strongmen and military juntas, the way they stay in power is they have to hand out the goods. They have to maintain a strata of society that is loyal to them. And the way that Pinochet or Rios Montt of Guatemala or Somoza of Nicaragua, the way that they stayed in power was there was a layer, a kind of middle class in the country that got taken care of by the military regime while they brutalized the peasants and slaughtered the indigenous people, while they repressed the organized political left, while they disappeared students and their bodies would be found dumped in the streets. They also had a middle-class constituency of people that they took care of. They tended to have nationalized industries that were under the control of the military. They tended to, kind of have a layer of the population that they handed out the goods to in order to keep society stable and maintain their authoritarian military state, hold off the threat of communist revolution. But as the Cold War was coming to an end, the U.S. imperialists realized that they did not need this, and that actually austerity was the model that they wanted to impose. They wanted to cut government spending, reduce the public sector all throughout South and Central America. And in order to do that, they had to get rid of these military strongmen and juntas. They instead had to replace them with a liberal democratic government, or a government that was so weak that it would have to take whatever the IMF and the World Bank would throw at them. They wanted to replace these brutal authoritarian military states with pathetic open societies. George Soros and his Open Society Institute, while they were certainly not socialists or revolutionaries, they supported the overthrow of Pinochet. They supported the overthrow of Franco in Spain, and it was because it would further this agenda of neoliberalism. And as neoliberal economics and austerity became the prevailing mode in Latin America, with the rise of the IMF and the World Bank, we saw the replacement of the military juntas with, liberal democratic governments that were weak, that rolled over, that had to do whatever the Wall Street bankers told them to do. And as a result of that, the conditions in these countries dramatically changed. Under Pinochet, under these authoritarian regimes, you couldn't have a communist party. You couldn't even have a labor movement in some cases. However, in the new quote-unquote open societies, you could have open political organizing. Communists could once again have public events, and they could run for office. They could organize demonstrations. And so the cities in Latin America once again became a center of political organizing. And it was conferences that took place in Cuba during the 1990s, in which academics and Marxist organizers from all across the world, and especially South and Central America, gathered, that the communists of Latin America decided to change their tactics yet again. And instead of trying to organize guerrilla warfare in the countryside, they went to the cities, and they built a popular front against neoliberalism. They organized with the Catholic Church. They organized with labor unions. They organized with community organizations. And they aligned even with capitalists who were opposed to neoliberalism. They created a polarization in the country. Are you for austerity? Are you for cuts in public spending, or are you against it? And it was based on this polarization and this organization of a popular front against neoliberalism, against the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, that Hugo Chavez was elected in 1999 as president of Venezuela. And when he took office, you'll remember that Hugo Chavez said he was for neither socialism or capitalism. He was for whatever was best for Venezuela. And there were a lot of Venezuelan millionaires who supported him and backed him. A lot of wealthy capitalists who supported Hugo Chavez because they were in competition with the Wall Street imperialists. And they didn't want Venezuela's economy to be further imploded. So Chavez took office. But then, of course, after 9/11, after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. imperialists tried to overthrow Hugo Chavez. But Chavez was brought back to power in 2002, defeating the coup because the working class came out to support him, and the rank-and-file soldiers rose up and supported him. And soon, even though this popular front had started, led by Venezuelan capitalists who were opposed to neoliberalism, and even though the communists had entered an alliance and a repolarization against imperialism, soon the working class, the rank-and-file soldiers, and the broad masses of people were the key factor. And Chavez announced that Venezuela was moving toward 21st century socialism. And the Bolivarian road to socialism emerged. And we saw in 2006, Bolivia join the road to 21st century socialism. We saw Nicaragua, and the Sandinistas come back to power in 2006 because they changed their tactics, because they realized that functioning in the old way was not going to work. One should read the polemics that Fidel Castro wrote against the FARC, right? The FARC of Colombia was waging guerrilla warfare, and in 1992, the Communist Party of Colombia urged the FARC to become a legal political organization. The FARC said that they're not going to do so. So Fidel Castro wrote some pretty harsh polemics against the FARC, and the Cuban government stopped giving weapons and support to the FARC. And Cuba said basically that armed struggle may be a tactic. When your country is an authoritarian military state, you may have to engage in armed struggle. But it should never become a way of life, right? It should never become a means to an end. It is a means to an end. It is not a way of life. It's not a fetish. And that there is a new moment, and the situation is changing in Colombia, and Fidel Castro urged the FARC to organize in a different way, to orient themselves towards the cities, toward the fight against austerity, and they didn't do it. And this is Fidel Castro, who himself took power in an armed struggle. And this is Cuba that had been arming, the FARC and arming the Sandinistas of Nicaragua, but yet they understood that the situation had changed. The political model the imperialists were using had changed, and that the tactics and the situation needed to be adjusted. And so it's with this understanding that we can now look at the situation facing the United States of America. Because we are in the middle of a crisis of capitalism in the United States. Now, the main cause of this crisis, is the problem of overproduction. It's the computer revolution. That with technology, the capitalists can produce things more efficiently than ever before. There used to be these things called book binderies, right? Years ago, there were these things called book binderies, where hundreds of people worked all day binding books. If you wanted to publish a book, there had to be at least 5,000 copies of it published, or it wouldn't be cost effective. And all kinds of people worked all day binding books. Well, now we've got Amazon, create a page. We got buttons where you print on demand. You push a button and the machine pumps out one single book. Right? No workers required. There are many other examples. At this point, computers trade stocks more efficiently than humans do. Computers play chess more efficiently than humans do. The role of the worker at the assembly line is being drastically reduced. We are seeing such a huge technological leap with artificial intelligence, with 3D printers, that human beings are being, pushed out of the assembly line. And the classic problem of overproduction is once again asserting itself, because human beings and the workers are also the consumers. And if you push the worker out of production, the worker cannot buy back the product he produces, and you have a prolonged economic crisis. Jack Ma, the CEO at Alibaba, he has talked about how World War I followed some great technological leaps. World War II followed some great technological leaps, and that when there is a big leap in the technology the capitalists use to produce products, and when the role of the worker is greatly diminished, it is followed by a long, prolonged economic crisis. And the prolonged economic crisis usually results in political turmoil. And then that political turmoil ultimately resulted in World War I. The same thing happened during the 1930s with the Great Depression. Henry Ford and his technological innovations in the assembly line was said to have created a capitalism that was forever sustainable. They used to say Henry Ford has defeated Karl Marx because he's created an efficient form of capitalism. But then, 1929, you saw the stock market crash, you saw the economic problems that ensued, you saw mass starvation, and Ford had not overtaken Marx, and there was yet again an economic crisis. The capitalists began to fight with one another. You had the rise of fascism and ultimately the Second World War. And that political crises, and generally stemming from economic crises, lead to international crises. And we are facing at this point an international crisis because there's an alternative economy centered around Russia and China, centered around the Bolivarian countries of Latin America, centered around Iran and their allies in the Middle East, that is emerging. Meanwhile, the Western capitalist countries are crashing and burning because of this problem of overproduction. The labor aristocracy. This is something that Lenin wrote about excessively. You can read his very important essay, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism. The way the imperialist countries were stabilized during the ascendancy of imperialism during the 20th century was through the maintenance of what was called the aristocracy of labor. It was a strata of well-paid workers in the homeland who saw their living standard go up as imperialism was in ascendancy, and their loyalty was bought to empire. They identified with the capitalist bosses, not with other workers. They stood with the capitalist bosses against low-income workers at home and so-called unskilled workers at home, as well as the colonized people around the world. And it was this kind of well-paid industrial middle class, this aristocracy of labor, that enabled the imperialist countries to be very solid. And it was the main barrier to revolutionary organizing in the United States, in Britain, in France, in Germany, this aristocracy of labor. And it was because the aristocracy of labor dominated the Labor Party in Britain, the German Social Democratic Party, the labor unions in the United States, that you didn't have a revolutionary crisis. And World War I ultimately broke out because these parties supported World War I. Even though they'd promised never to support World War I, they supported it because these workers saw their living standard go up as imperialism was in ascendancy. They were loyal to imperialism. And Lenin, in his famous essay, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, says, in response to this, the revolutionaries must go lower and deeper to the real masses. And furthermore, Lenin said that because of the development of the aristocracy of labor, that it would be the East and the colonized countries of the world that would be where the revolutionary energy of the 20th century was. That the homeland of imperialism, the West, was going to have this stratification of the working class, that would make solidarity very difficult. So the revolutionary energy was going to be in Africa and Asia, and in countries like Russia, countries like China, countries like those of South America. It would be the colonized people of the world fighting to be free and break out of imperialism. That was where the revolutionary energy in the 20th century would be. And that in the West, revolutionary organizers would have to contend with this problem of the aristocracy of labor. And the interesting thing about the period we're living in now is that what we are overseeing is that because of the computer revolution, because of the global nature of production in our time, a number of factors are contributing to the erosion of the aristocracy of labor. And the rise of Donald Trump, the rise of the new right in Europe, is largely a response to the fact that the aristocracy of labor is being demolished for their own reasons. The capitalists have determined that they no longer need to maintain a layer of well-paid industrial workers in the homeland. And the communities that used to be the basis of this, you talk about Pittsburgh, you talk about Detroit, Minneapolis, the cities throughout the heartland of America that were once prosperous, suburbs, are now falling apart. Those homes are foreclosed. The living standard is dropping. People are dying of opioids. The U.S. life expectancy has decreased by 1.9 years since the beginning of the pandemic. There is a rise in suicide and hopelessness. The incomes of young Americans are very low in comparison to their parents' generation. And in such a situation, it's important to have a conversation about changing tactics. During the 1960s, you had a political upsurge in the United States, but it was a political upsurge among the African-American people who were rebelling against racism and standing up as a continuation of the civil rights movement. There was a rise in black nationalism and anti-imperialist feeling, the rise of the Black Panthers, the rebellions that swept the country in the aftermath of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And then you had on the college campuses many college students who didn't want to fight in Vietnam and were opposed to the Vietnam War and the rise of anti-imperialist sentiments. But among the broad masses of working-class Americans, the labor aristocracy was still very strong. And, following the 1960s political upsurge, you had a development called the New Communist Movement, where there were various groupings associated, previously with Students for a Democratic Society, the Progressive Labor Party, the Revolutionary Union, the October League, and these were young people who'd been part of this political upsurge in the 1960s who wanted to form a new communist party. And they went and they got jobs in factories, and they moved into working-class neighborhoods. And largely, they heard their co-workers in the factories tell them, we don't want to hear it. The labor aristocracy was still very strong, and average white American workers were not interested in becoming communists. And they worked in the factories, and they organized, and there were some isolated areas of success. In Detroit, among the black workers, you had the development of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, or DRUM, which eventually became the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And in Detroit, the new communist movement among African-American auto workers and other workers in Detroit was quite successful. You had the eventual election of Coleman Young, who was kind of a friend of the Communist Party, who was elected and was a radical. So there was some success in Detroit. In Georgia, again, among the black workers, you did have some walkouts. You did have the election of progressive people, to office on a local level. But largely, among the wider country, the new communist movement was not successful. And then when you had an economic crisis set in 1978, amid the Carter administration, suddenly workers were losing their jobs and living standards were going down. Many of these activists from the new communist movement thought, now is our chance. We've been in the factory for almost a decade. The workers have not been listening to us, but now is the moment. Now they're finally facing this big economic crisis. Now we can swing into action. And you saw almost some left adventurism that took place. In Greensboro, North Carolina, the Communist Workers' Party, a Maoist group, challenged the Ku Klux Klan to a fight. And, the Ku Klux Klan showed up and shot 5 of them in broad daylight, filmed by a local TV crew. The Greensboro Massacre, a horrendous killing. But the reason that the Communist Workers' Party had engaged in provocative actions and challenged the KKK to a fight was because they thought, now is the moment. If we don't have the workers in motion now, there's no hope. Right? And then you can look at 1979, how the Revolutionary Communist Party went into went into kind of a crazed panic, and they called a general strike on May 1st, 1980, May Day 1980. And again, this was motivated by kind of a panic. They thought, now there's an economic crisis, now the workers are finally going to listen to us. But they didn't, right? In response to the Iranian Revolution, in response to the economic crisis, you had, a turn to reaction and the rise of Ronald Reagan. And it was amid the rise of Ronald Reagan, it was amid that you started to have what you might call the Great Retreat, which is the communist movement in the United States, Marxist-Leninists, Maoists, Trotskyites. They retreated from the broad masses. They found somewhere else to go. Some of them went into academia and worked on the campuses. A lot of the academic leftism that we see in the United States is largely a result of individuals who had previously been communist organizers in the 1970s going back and getting their PhD and becoming professors and writing papers about race and gender oppression. Some of them went into the labor movement and instead of trying to organize the broad masses, tried to work within the labor bureaucracy and kind of organize within it. Some Maoist groups, some Trotskyite groups moved that way. You had some groups that focused on the African American struggle and their struggle against police brutality long before it was trendy, I must say. Nowadays, talk of police brutality, Black Lives Matter is everywhere. But there was a time, I remember, where among the black community there was a feeling of this. There was a feeling of this, police brutality and racism among communists. But among the broad masses of U.S. society, there was denial about the problem of police brutality. But there were some communists who focused on that because that was where there was at least some revolutionary energy. But there was kind of a retreat from the broad masses of people. There was a feeling that if you, went to an average working class neighborhood in Iowa or Kansas or Idaho or Alabama and tried to talk to them about communism, nobody would want to hear it. They'd spit on you and tell you to go back to Russia, you dirty communist, and no one would want to hear it. So you got to find someplace else to go. You got to stage manage the anti-war protests in Washington, D.C. and try to keep the hippie movement going. You got to get a job in academia. You got to work in the labor bureaucracy. You got to just kind of, secretly campaign for the Democrats and suck up to the Democrats because you can't go to the broad masses of people. The broad masses of Americans are racist and reactionary and have no revolutionary potential. That was the feeling. And that feeling was largely correct in 1980. And that feeling was largely correct in 1990 as the Soviet Union was falling. But if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. A does not equal A. All that is solid melts into air. You never step into the same river twice. The world is constantly changing. And we are seeing, as the labor aristocracy is breaking down, as the United States has all kinds of municipalities that are literally unpaving the roads, because they can't maintain paved roads. They have this device called a reclaimer, where this big machine pulls up the asphalt and pulverizes it. And where you used to have a paved road, you now have a gravel or dirt road. While, water is not being properly purified across the United States of America, while the next generation is facing a lifetime of low-wage, short-term service sector jobs, the situation has changed. And Bernie Sanders was quite popular when he ran for president in 2016, and quite popular once again when he ran for president in 2020. And there is a broad amount of interest in socialism all across the United States. There has never, in my lifetime, in my lifetime as a young American, I'm only 34 years old, there's never been so much interest in anti-capitalist ideas. Wherever you go in America, white, black, urban, rural, there is a feeling that the government doesn't work for the people. The government works for a group of rich people who have a very different interest than we do. Furthermore, there is a feeling that our civil liberties and freedoms are being stripped away and that our rights are being taken away. That's a widespread feeling in the United States. And so the response of the government has been to whipsaw the population. They have told the urban middle class and the African American community that they can only gain at the expense of the rural and suburban white population. And they have told the white population of the United States and the rural and suburban white population of the United States that they can only gain at the expense of the urban middle class and of the black community. And there are red states and blue states, and the population is being whipsawed. This is the process of Bonapartism. If you read Karl Marx's very important pamphlet, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, it talks about how when a capitalist crisis emerges, the capitalist class begin to fight amongst each other. As the rate of profits is decreasing, they scramble to try and have the government stabilize the economy. They all want the economy to get better, but they all want the other capitalists to be the ones to pay for it. And there are factions among the ruling class that battle for control of the state in the hopes of using the state to stabilize the economy at the expense of the other capitalists. This is the Bonapartist struggle. And in some cases, you can have progressive Bonapartists, like Roosevelt, or like, Louis Bonaparte, who, took power and built railroads and hired the unemployed, built hospitals for low-income people. And in some cases, you can have brutal reactionary Bonapartism, like Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini, who stabilized the economy by, putting half the country in concentration camps and the other in military uniforms, and by, creating a layer of workers to be slave labor, essentially, in concentration camps. So there are different tactics, there are different, rhetorical forms, there are different factions. But every section of the ruling class is trying to seize control of the state and use the state to stabilize the economy at the expense of the other capitalists. They're trying to recruit the working people to be their foot soldiers in this inner capitalist battle for control of the state, and that is what generally happens during such a crisis. Now, one thing that must be talked about when we're talking about socialism and Marxism in the United States, it's taboo to talk about. No one ever dares bring it up. It's a topic that is forbidden. But it shouldn't be, because the evidence is right there before our eyes. It is not a secret that the intelligence apparatus of the U.S. government has spent a lot of money and a lot of time trying to manipulate socialist and Marxist politics. The first great example of this was the Congress for Cultural Freedom program that the CIA set up in 1949, where they hired a number of Trotskyites, Irving Howe, Irving Kristol, Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt, and they published their writings. And they published Partisan Review magazine in the United States, and Counter magazine in Britain, Der Monat magazine in Germany. And they popularized Theodor Adorno, and they popularized Herbert Marcuse, and they popularized a form of Marxism that focused on cultural issues and was, in a way, hostile to the Soviet Union, hostile to China, hostile to Cuba, but at the same time was sympathetic to intellectuals and the middle class. And there are many other examples of this. I mean, throughout the 1960s and 70s, you had the CIA sponsoring African-American art festivals, and, you had promoting the work of James Baldwin because he was an African-American intellectual who was anti-communist while they tried to suppress W.E.B. Du Bois. And the meddling of the intelligence apparatus in leftist and Marxist politics is a fact. It is reality. One of the founders of Democratic Socialists of America is Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem was the face of feminism in the United States during the 1970s. She was the editor of Ms. magazine. But Gloria Steinem was also a CIA operative. The New York Times, revealed that early on. The way she started her career in political activism was with CIA money. She went to the World Festival of Youth and Students, this communist youth gathering in Vienna in the early 60s. And she and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Barney Frank and a number of other people went, pretending to be Marxist activists, went to the youth festival, set off smoke bombs, disrupted events, tried to stir up fights between the Polish delegations and the Russian delegations, and that she basically ran CIA interference in the Marxist movement in the early 60s, and eventually was propelled to the position of being the voice of feminism in the United States and being a founding member of Democratic Socialists of America. Irving Howe, who's also an ideologue, who was considered one of the founders of Democratic Socialists of America. He was a Shachtmanite Trotskyite. His work was promoted by the CIA and Partisan Review and elsewhere. He wrote a polemic saying that as a Marxist, he is partisan to the West in the Cold War. And he wrote articles for the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, criticizing and attacking the anti-Vietnam War protests, attacking solidarity with Palestine. And he was propelled to the position of being the leader of Democratic Socialists of America. It is wrong to assume that all of the right wing, or all of the capitalist class in the United States, all of the intelligence agencies, all of the military are right wing, are conservative, are Republicans. That is not true. There is a liberal side to the imperialists. The Rockefeller family were very much advocates of birth control, abortion. They sponsored the Kinsey Report, the work of Alfred Kinsey and his research, and they didn't do it because they just cared about women's rights. They didn't do it because they were, just egalitarian thinkers. They did it because they're Malthusians. They believe the problems of the planet, flow from overpopulation. And they believe the ideas of Robert Malthus, that we need to drive down the population to stabilize, the economy. That's what they believed. And they promoted a lot of what is left-wing in the United States. And nowadays, the Ford Foundation, various Rockefeller think tanks, and there is a whole layer that's tied to some of the wealthiest, oldest, and most powerful capitalists in the United States that is trying to give U.S. imperialism a woke makeover. They want the people around the world not to see the United States as a country founded on slavery, founded on genocide of the indigenous people, but rather as a country that goes around promoting human rights and freedom and social justice. And in order to do this, they are changing the Pentagon, and they are changing the nature of U.S. institutions. They have promoted the 1619 Project of the New York Times, that is just going over the history of the United States, claiming that the entire reason the American Revolution happened was simply because of the desire to maintain slavery, whitewashing the fact that the British Empire is a brutal institution all over the world, making it seem like the only purpose the American Revolution served was the preservation of slavery. All of this is going on because the capitalists are fighting with each other. And there is the building up of one faction of the ruling class against another faction of the ruling class. There is a struggle going on. And this is all taking place. Now, it's important to note that wherever you go in the world, no matter where you go, no matter what country you go to, socialist, capitalist, Western, Eastern, First World, Third World, you're going to have what you can call a revolutionary intelligentsia. And this is a layer of people who are interested in revolutionary ideas. They're interested in Marxism, anarchism, and socialism for aesthetic reasons, not for economic ones. They are interested in it because they are attracted to the rebellion. They are attracted to a desire for freedom. They are filled with outrage against injustice, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, this revolutionary intelligentsia tends to be isolated from the broad masses of people. It's never anything close to 5% of the population. However, the history of the Marxist movement in Russia and China and Cuba and Latin America is people within this revolutionary intelligentsia maneuvering and figuring out tactics and then taking Marxism out of the revolutionary intelligentsia and getting it to the broad masses of people. The Bolsheviks were made up originally of this revolutionary intelligentsia, but Lenin had the tactical brilliance of getting the Bolsheviks to go and organize the broad masses of Russian people, break out of just this revolutionary intelligentsia, and take power. Even the name Bolsheviks, it means majority group or majoritarians. Now, we know the reason they were called the Bolsheviks was because Lenin called a meeting in 1903, and at the meeting there was a split, and the majority of the people in the meeting supported Lenin, and they were the majority group, and the minority that didn't support Lenin, they were called the minority group. But to average people in Russia at the time of the revolution, this group called the Bolsheviks they were the majority people. They were fighting for the majority. They were the majoritarians. They were the populists. They were fighting for a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. They were for the majority against the minority, the wealthy capitalists and bankers and war makers. And calling themselves Bolsheviks, they were basically saying we're populists. We're for the broad masses of people against the minority elite. That's why the name stuck. It had a different connotation than the origination of the name in 1903 in London at this meeting in exile. And if you look at Stalin and Trotsky, Trotsky very much represented the revolutionary intelligentsia. He represented, this intellectual elite milieu. He was very well known in exile. He lived most of his life in Vienna, in New York City, in London, in Berlin. He was known internationally as a very articulate speaker and writer, but he had contempt, especially for the peasantry of Russia. But Stalin, on the other hand, Stalin was from a small town in Georgia. Stalin was the son of a bootmaker, and he attended seminary school. Joseph Stalin, it's kind of funny. There was a band, a rock and roll band that was popular during the 1960s, and they were called Country Joe and the Fish Band. And what is not known is that they were actually named after Stalin and Mao, because Mao said the masses are the water and the revolutionaries are the fish. And Stalin was known as Country Joe because he was from Georgia. He was from a rural village called Gori in Georgia. So Country Joe was Stalin, And the fish was Mao, because he said the masses are the water and the revolutionaries are the fish. So Country Joe and the Fish Band was actually named after Stalin and Mao. The members, the rock and roll singers, were originally communists. So this is who Stalin was. And the reason that Stalin ascended to leadership after the death of Lenin was because Stalin was deeply in touch with the soul of the Russian people. He knew the Russian people very, very well. He knew the peoples of the surrounding countries that made up the Soviet Union very well. He knew what compromises to make. He knew what tactics to use. He knew how to orient Soviet society to effectually and effectively lead the broad masses of people to transform and industrialize the Soviet Union, to defeat the Nazis, and to ultimately move towards socialism. If you read, there's a very good book by Simon Sebag Montefiore, who's a right-wing conservative, but he wrote a biography of Stalin called Young Stalin. It's about Stalin before the Bolshevik Revolution. And in his book, he describes Stalin's organizing style this way. He says, Stalin was hostile to bumptious intellectuals, but he was less with the less educated worker revolutionaries, who did not arouse his inferiority complex. He played the teacher, the priest. The workers listened reverently to this young preacher. And it was no coincidence that many of the revolutionaries were seminarists and workers of often pious ex-peasants. Trotsky, agitating in another city, remembered that many of the workers thought the movement resembled the early Christians and had to be taught that they should be atheists. The way Stalin was able to build, the Bolshevik Party among the broad masses as the editor of Pravda, not Iskra. Iskra was the theoretical journal for the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, but the daily agitational newspaper of the Bolsheviks was Pravda, which means truth, which was this broad editorial newspaper that was widely distributed among the workers. Stalin was the editor of Pravda, and he knew and he loved the peoples of the Soviet Union, of the Russian Empire. He had a deep connection with them, and he knew how to organize them. And that's why Stalin was ultimately the leader of the Soviet Union, who industrialized it and defeated the Nazis. He had a deep love and connection. And if you are a serious revolutionary in the United States, you have to, while condemning the racism of U.S. society, while condemning the imperialism and the horrors of U.S. society, you have to strive to develop this kind of deep spiritual connection with the broad masses of the American people. We need to know the people of the United States from every region, from every ethnic group, from every background. We need to know them and love them the way Stalin loved the Soviet people. There has to be that deep connection. If you're serious about mobilizing the people of the United States to build socialism, you have to develop this kind of connection. You must love the American people if you're going to lead them to dismantle imperialism, lead them towards socialism. And isolating yourself within the revolutionary intelligentsia is only going to lead to a lack of success and continued disconnection. And this is a reality that you have to understand. Fidel Castro knew the Cuban people and loved the Cuban people with his heart and soul. Mao Zedong knew the Chinese people, and he knew the peasantry of China, and with his heart and soul, he was able to organize them. And if you are a serious organizer and revolutionary in any country, you must be motivated, as Che Guevara said, by feelings of great love. You must develop a bond and connection with the people. And if you continue to just condemn the people of the country and say that they're racist, they're backward, they're ignorant, to just extol hatred upon them, you're never going to be able to be their leader. You might feel good. You might feel morally righteous. You might feel like you are the good one, and you are condemning the others, and you have achieved, validation for yourself as a revolutionary. But you're not really going to ultimately be the one to stand at their head and lead them when a revolutionary crisis comes. That is why the Center for Political Innovation has adopted the slogan, "Out of the movement and to the masses," because there is a need to escape from these isolated enclaves of the revolutionary intelligentsia. And there is a need to get to average Americans with a socialist message. If we, revolutionaries, Marxists, anti-imperialists, anti-racists, progressives, don't get to the broad masses of Americans, it's pretty clear that someone else will. And the events of January 6th have made that abundantly clear in the United States of America. If we do not break with the synthetic left that has been cultivated and controlled by sections of the ruling class to carry out their Bonapartist agenda, that has been kind of isolated from the masses and is being used to try and give imperialism a woke makeover. And if we don't get to the broad masses of people, things in the United States are only going to get worse. It is an absolute necessity that average Americans who are losing their jobs and losing their homes in communities throughout the country see that imperialism is their enemy, and that the same big banks and corporations that are devastating their communities are also devastating the world, and driving us into wars. It is an absolute necessity that working people throughout the United States of America come to stand in solidarity with people around the world that are resisting imperialism and identify with them, and identify their struggle and the defense of their communities from austerity with the struggles of the colonized people around the world for independence. They should come to see the people of Africa and Asia and Latin America. They should come to see Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, China, Russia as their allies against Wall Street. This is an absolute necessity, because if this doesn't happen, things will only get worse. Now, I just want to conclude my remarks with some final thoughts. Rosa Luxemburg, in her very famous pamphlet, the Junius pamphlet, that she wrote opposing World War I, she very famously proposed and put forward the thesis of socialism or barbarism. And she said it was not necessarily a foregone conclusion that Europe would have a socialist revolution. That if imperialism continued on the course of World War I, that it was likely that the West would just collapse as the Roman Empire collapsed. The Roman Empire collapsed, and the result was the depopulation of Europe. It took 1,100 years for Europe to restore the population that it had at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. And the fall of the Roman Empire was not a progressive event. Even though the Roman Empire was an abomination of slavery and brutal repression, the fall of the Roman Empire didn't result in a higher plane being reached. It resulted in the opposite. It resulted in a move backward by human civilization. And right now in the West, the question isn't whether the West will move towards socialism or not. That is not the question. The question is, will the West continue on a trajectory of collapse, or will the West turn around? Will the West readjust itself and join in this new economy coming out of Eurasia, Russia and China, etc.? Or will the West continue to deteriorate and decay into barbarism? And for a long time, Marxists in the United States have had this assumption that the whole world is centered around the West, that the workers of the world are waiting for the workers of America to move, right? That they're all waiting for the workers in the imperialist homeland to start moving, and it's our job to stir up chaos and create instability here in the homeland in solidarity with people around the world, and they're all waiting for us because the world is always going to be centered around the West. This is Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, and it's wrong. If the West collapses, if the United States collapses and falls to pieces, the world will just recenter around Russia and China. Russia and China are not going to collapse. We are facing collapse, and working people throughout the United States are seeing the collapse. They're seeing the rising police state. They're seeing the decay of their communities. They're terrified of this collapse. And it is absolutely important that the Marxist movement not look like we are trying to bring further collapse, further chaos, and further instability. We are the defenders of stability. We want a government of action that will fight for working families, that will provide jobs and health care and education, that will put oil and gas and natural resources under public ownership, that will rebuild the infrastructure of the country. We want a government that will embolden working people and bring them into politics to reinvent the United States and dismantle imperialism. We want a whole new society that will be much more stable, much more prosperous. We want the uplifting of historically oppressed and marginalized groups. We want to dismantle racism and empower people. We want to bring the United States up and have the United States enter a new relationship with countries around the world based on win-win cooperation. Our message needs to be an optimistic one. It needs to be one that is very much about empowering people and telling working people that we are your champion. We're not your enemy. We don't think that you're an evil, bought-off labor aristocrat. We think that the imperialists are just as much your enemy as the imperialists are the enemies of the Cubans or the Venezuelans or the Iranians. There needs to be a message of solidarity and understanding that we are the bringers of order, not the bringers of instability, not the bringers of chaos, but the bringers of order. We point to the way out of the chaos and instability that the decaying imperialist and capitalist system is bringing us. Now, I just want to conclude my reading from Georgy Plekhanov. Georgy Plekhanov was the father of Russian Marxism, and he wrote a very important book called The Role of the Individual in History, talking about what it is that makes one heroic. What it is that makes one heroic. And he wrote this. He said, a great man is precisely a beginner because he sees further than others and desires things more strongly than others. He is a hero. But he is not a hero in the sense that he can stop or change the natural course of things, but in the sense that his activities are the conscious and free expression of the inevitable and unconscious course. And herein lies all the significance. Herein lies the whole power. But this significance is colossal, and the power is terrible. Millions of working people in the United States are suffering. Millions of working people in the United States are angry. They are not looking for the libidinal release of tearing things down. They are looking for forces that project strength, forces that project the ability of popular power to solve their problems, forces that can lead them to tear down the historic divisions of racism and national oppression, forces that can mobilize around the idea that we can have a government that could fight for working people and we could get beyond imperialism. We need to drastically change our tactics if we're going to win. If the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. It is time to get out of the movement and get to the masses. The working people of the United States are ready to hear about socialism. The time is now. Out of the movement to the masses. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. And that concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Caleb. Terrific presentation. What I want to do now is just take a moment. We're going to take a short break, and I just wanted to let you know that next week we are having a presentation about the left and veterans issues. The speakers will be Suzanne Gordon and Steve Early, co-authors of a new book, Our Veterans, Winners, Losers, Friends, and Enemies, and a new book, Our Veterans. They're Richmond-based activists, journalists who have been involved in the veterans movement for quite some time. I also wanted to take a moment to have people hear a short fundraising appeal. And if Richard, if you would go ahead and do that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Caleb, and the rest. I want to just make a short appeal for funds. We're associated with the Marxist library in Oakland, the Niebyl-Proctor Marxist library. We support them, and we have some expenses of our own, modest ones, but we need some small contributions from all of you. And I put some information on the chat on how you can contribute, and if you miss that, there's a information on the email you received, and there's more information you can contribute through the website. So please, as Caleb said, the individual can make a difference, and you have a chance to make a difference in a modest way through your financial contribution to our work to bring you important speakers like Caleb and others. So please make that contribution today. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Again, I just want to remind everybody that you can contact us through icssmarks.org. There's a contact form on the website. Also information about making a donation if you're so interested. What I'd like to do now is ask people to raise your hands for questions and or comments. The way to do this is to click on the reactions button if you have a relatively updated version of Zoom installed on your computer. And we'll take questions. We'll limit people to about 2 minutes for questions and comments, and give Caleb a chance to respond. So if you guys would go ahead and people would raise your hands. Let me start with Golden. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Oh.
Caleb, thank you very much for this terrific presentation. I'm proud of you. as a young person for reaching such a on-the-spot understanding and analysis of the world by digesting and linking the history. And I wish we had more of it. Thanks again.
Thank you.
That's terrific. Caleb, any comment on that?
Well, it says I cannot.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead and move on to our next questioner? Let's go ahead with Trajan from New York. If you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I have a question. Since Caleb brought up the China and the successes, and China is really booming in their economy. They had 8% GMP this past year, and socialism is working out well. I'm surprised why Russia, being on the border of China, why more Russians aren't pushing for the Communist Party to be in power in Russia after seeing the successes in China. So what is your opinion on the party coming back in power in Russia?
Well, actually, there has been a significant increase in the support that the Russian Communist Party has. They're doing the best they've done since the 1990s at this point. The recent elections that took place, for the Duma and the Parliament, they did very well. And a lot of that is based on the fact that there is a feeling that China is very much an important ally of Russia. There's also frustration in Russia about corruption, about income inequality, etc. But it's also important to note that the Communist Party in Russia is not the only entity that has nostalgia for the Soviet Union. Within the entire government of Russian apparatus, I mean, you can find forces that admire Stalin, admire the defeat of the Nazis, that are suspicious of Western capitalism and imperialism. The Communist Party is a specific group, but there is pretty widespread feeling of nostalgia. That said, there's also a very strong, kind of conservative nationalism in Russia. There's a feeling that Stalin was great in the same way that Tsar Alexander was great, and the same way that Ivan the Terrible was great, and that the achievements of the Soviet Union flow from Russian nationalism, and there is some conservative feelings that don't seem to contradict a lot of the Soviet nostalgia. So Russian politics is extremely different than politics in the United States, but the Communist Party is an institution that's very big and very influential in Russia. No question about it. They do tend to speak very positively of China, and it's going to be very difficult to do what the imperialists did during the Cold War and pull Russia and China apart, because Russia is, their economy is centered around selling oil and gas. Meanwhile, China needs to import a lot of oil and gas, and as the United States puts tariffs on China, it makes it harder for China to import oil and gas from other countries, so they're going to have to import it from Russia. And as the USA is hostile to Russia and stirring up these crazy allegations they're planning to invade Ukraine or something, then Russia is going to need to sell oil and gas to China. So the countries have an economic bond that's going to be very, very hard for the imperialists to pull apart. And I think as China becomes more important to Russia, the Communist Party will probably increase its influence within the Russian government apparatus. I think that's very likely to happen. The other thing is that, Putin will eventually leave office. He doesn't intend to be president until he dies. He's currently president, but, what comes after Putin is a very big question, because there's a lot of feeling in Russia that they need a bigger, welfare state. There's also a feeling in Russia that that nationalism is very important. There's a lot of social conservatism in Russia that fits in with some economically left ideas, but is also Russian politics is very complex. But the Communist Party is very influential, and at this point, they're doing better than they've done since the '90s. I'll tell you that much.
Thank you. Next up, I'd like to ask Michael K., followed by Keith, Gene, and Raj. So, Michael, if you'd unmute yourself, ask your question.
Yes, my question I put into the chat. It seems like a forever discussion about the progressive left versus the Democratic Party, or the progressive left versus the threat of fascism. I assume I know where you stand on that, but can you comment on the threat of fascism and how the Democratic Party may or may not be part of a popular front against fascism?
Well, in a period like the one we're living in, the capitalists are going to try and stabilize the economy using the state. And there will be Bonapartist efforts to build some kind of authoritarian state to stabilize the economy. And there may be fascistic variants of that. But what we saw from the Trump administration was certainly right-wing. It was certainly not what he promised his supporters. He claimed he was anti-war, and he clearly wasn't. He claimed he was a champion of the American workers, and what did he do? He proceeded to lift regulations on Wall Street and make their lives harder and fight against labor unions. So Donald Trump was not good in any way, but he wasn't Hitler. Donald Trump wasn't Hitler, and the events of January 6th, they were certainly, illegal. I mean, it was criminal trespassing, it was vandalism, and it was certainly a violent, illegal action to enter the Capitol the way they did. But it was not an attempted military coup. There was not support for it in the Pentagon. Donald Trump was not psyching up his supporters to do it, and he didn't even pardon his supporters after he left. So, and part of this claim that we're on the brink of fascism is a way of forcing us to not compete with the synthetic left. It's a way of saying that because, oh my God, we're all going to be in concentration camps if we don't defeat Donald Trump, we can't push back against the anti-communism that is coming to dominate leftist circles. Identity politics, pessimism, Malthusianism, there is a big problem. Meanwhile, it has manifested itself in this feeling that if you do want to reach out to the broad masses of Americans, if you want to have a Medicare for all march, like Jimmy Dore called, that makes you a fascist, right? This allegation that if you talk about economic demands, if you try to mobilize the workers, you're a quote-unquote class reductionist and a fascist. That is very widespread, and that is very, very dangerous.
Widespread.
What's that?
Where is it widespread that Medicare for all makes you a fascist? I don't understand that.
The Medicare for All march that was organized by Jimmy Dore and the Force the Vote demonstrations were widely accused by members of the Democratic Socialists of America of being fascist red-brown alliances. That was the term that was used, and it was basically told to by the leadership of DSA, by forces tied into the Democratic Party, that you can't attend the Medicare for All marches and demonstrations. You can't demand that AOC force the vote, because if you do, that means you're secretly working for Donald Trump. You're part of this red-brown alliance, etc. And that is a very, very dangerous message, right? That I think that, the argument was that we were supposed to vote for Biden. We were supposed to vote for AOC, forces like this, so we could push them to the left, so we could challenge them. And then the second that anyone started to do that, the allegation came that, oh, well, then that means you're on the right. And that is very dangerous. I'm not against voting for Democrats. I campaigned for Charles Barron here in New York, a great anti-imperialist. I don't think that this rule that a lot of leftists have that, like, thou shalt not vote for any candidate who has a D next to their name, it's a calculated decision. Karl Marx voted for Abraham, he didn't vote, he wasn't a U.S. citizen, but he supported the re-election of Abraham Lincoln in 1864, who was a Republican. The Communist Party campaigning for Roosevelt in 1936 amid, the rise of the CIO and the threat of fascism, that was absolutely correct. It's a tactical decision. And so I'm not opposed to, at some point, entering an alliance with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party if such a situation were to arise. But the idea that Trump is such a fascist and we are in such a danger that therefore we must, not compete with the synthetic left. We must not get to the broad masses of people, and we must go along with some of the more, toxic tendencies of the forces that are dominating left spaces right now. I don't accept that. And so that's my difference with those forces, I would say.
I would just comment that I wasn't talking about Trump. I was talking about Trumpism, which is a movement that is far beyond Trump, and I think is very dangerous. That's all. Thank you for your comments, sir.
Thank you. Next up is Keith, followed by Eugene, followed by Raj, followed by Rich. So Keith, if you would ask your question, please go ahead.
Okay, just want to switch tracks for a second. How do you see Russia and China as social structures? They're, the capitalist, are they socialist, or And also, what do you see as the motivation behind China's Belt and Road Initiative?
All right. Well, China I see as definitely a socialist society. And the reason that it's a socialist society is because, as we understand, Frederick Engels explained that capitalism is a system in which, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital, meaning that the economy is organized to make profits for private owners. Mao Zedong said, under capitalism, profits are in command. If you look at the Chinese economy, there's a huge amount of state-run industries. There are 5-year economic plans. The Communist Party, with its 90 million members, is in charge and dominates the economy. And while there is a private sector in which a lot of corporations make a lot of money, they don't have the power. There are billionaires who have been executed in China and given the death penalty because they got in the way of the Chinese Communist Party. There was an American company in China that was serving rotten meat to the public, and the CEOs were dragged out of the offices in handcuffs. In China, the capitalists may exist, but they exist at the whim of the Chinese Communist Party, which is based among the broad masses, 90 million members in every community, in every neighborhood. And the Communist Party is in charge. They aren't. The billionaires don't run China. The billionaires exist because the Chinese Communist Party wants them to exist and uses them to bring in foreign investment, uses them to help develop the country. But they don't have the power. The broad masses of Chinese people, as represented by the Communist Party, do. China's not capitalist because the economy does not function to make profits. It functions under the leadership of the Communist Party and its 5-year plans. And they extol Marxism, socialism with Chinese characteristics, Deng Xiaoping theory, Jiang Zemin's ideas, as well as Xi Jinping. And you can read The Governance of China. There's 3 volumes of it out, which you can read. Where President Xi Jinping quotes Marx and Lenin and Mao Zedong very extensively in explaining the way China is governed. That said, there are elements in the Chinese Communist Party that I think are straight-up believers in capitalism, but there are also elements in the Chinese Communist Party that are at this point wanting to return to the Mao era. And I think that Xi Jinping represents the centrist position in the Chinese Communist Party with his mask line campaign, his crackdown on corruption, and his efforts to bring Marxism back into public discourse. And I think also it's important to note that, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao waged a campaign against Confucius, criticized Lin Biao, criticized Confucius. Mao was trying to sweep away Confucianism and trying to build a new China based on Marxism. Nowadays in China, there is this feeling that Mao Zedong, and Confucius walk hand in hand, and kind of the unique identity of China that makes it not Western, right? And that Mao and Confucius are both part of China's unique non-Western identity. So, the ideology that the Chinese Communist Party espouses is not the same Marxism we saw during the Cold War. It's very clear. It's quite nationalistic. There is kind of, a nostalgia and a conservatism to it. So it's complicated, but largely I don't view China as a capitalist society. Russia is a very different case. You had the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. You had Boris Yeltsin coming in and just destroying the country economically, looting, mass privatizations, a rise in sex trafficking, the life expectancy decreased. The 1990s and the fall of the Soviet Union in Russia was a nightmare. However, it created such a crisis in the country, and you had, Saudi Arabia and the United States fomenting Chechnya and, separatist movements and Islamic terrorism, and you had Vladimir Putin coming to power as someone who had been part of the security services and the KGB, during the Soviet period and was a leader of the military, coming in and offering stability. And his support came from the layers of the Soviet bureaucracy that hadn't been broken up. They had been stripped of ideology, but they had not been broken up. There were huge state-run industries that still existed, and Putin came in and he restructured Russia's economy around a state-run oil company and a state-run gas company, Gazprom and Rosneft. And that, combined with the USA invading Iraq, which drove up the oil prices, you had some of the highest oil prices in history, that enabled Russia to suddenly have a lot more money and stabilize the economy. So Putin is widely loved because he used kind of the remnants of the Soviet bureaucracy to stabilize the economy of Russia. That said, most of the Russian state apparatus doesn't believe in Marxism at this point. They're heavily influenced by Marxism. Marxism, it was the ruling ideology in the formative political years. So they know Marxism very well. They know the problems of Western capitalism. But at this point, their views are much more nationalistic and conservative. The Russian Orthodox Church functions as kind of the main ideological vehicle through which the Russian state communicates its viewpoints. And you have kind of a a leftover from the Soviet bureaucracy that has reasserted itself to control the Russian economy. There are a lot of billionaires in Russia. There's a lot of oligarchs. There's also a lot of inequality. So, Russia is definitely a society that is in opposition to Western capitalism. It's definitely a society that's aligned with socialist countries like China, like Venezuela, like Cuba. But it's also a country that is kind of a contradiction, so to speak. I think during the Soviet period, Winston Churchill said that Russia is, a mystery wrapped in an enigma. And I think if you look at Russia nowadays with a lot of state-run industries, an economy that's largely centered around the state, but that state includes a lot of wealthy oligarchs, and that state, in a lot of ways is a state that in some ways kind of, rules over the Russian masses and is not simply, it's not as connected to the Russian masses as, say, the Chinese state is. It's a contradiction, and some people use the term Bonapartism, and they see Russia as like long-term Bonapartism. Some people compare Russia to the Asian tiger countries like Singapore. So Russia is a unique case. I wouldn't call it a socialist society simply out of respect for them, because they maintain we are not a socialist country. And they don't believe in Marxism as their state ideology. That's very clear. But you can't put Russia in the same category as you put Western or neoliberal free market countries, because it's not that. But it's also a country that's made clear it's not the Soviet Union anymore.
Okay, next up is
I'm sorry, but what about the Belt and Road Initiative? What do you see?
Sure.
On that? That was.
Sure. Well, the way Western capitalism works, and this is the important thing, if you read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin, imperialism is about holding back economic development. Imperialism is about keeping the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. When the imperialists went to India, they burned all the textile looms, and they forced the people of India to import their cloth from Britain. The USA, Libya used to be the top oil exporting country in Africa under the leadership of Gaddafi, and the USA went there and bombed it to shreds with NATO, and now people are fleeing and trying to get out of there, and they're exporting about 10% of the amount of oil they exported under Gaddafi. The imperialists want to keep these countries impoverished client states so that the Western monopolies can maintain their monopoly and their dominance over the world economy. China is a very different situation. China is bringing development to countries in the developing world. It's building up the state sector usually, building infrastructure, hospitals, schools, highways, railroads, power plants. In doing so, it helps facilitate the rise of a domestic economy in those countries. It trades with the domestic economy of those countries. China gets wealthier trading with those countries. Those countries also get wealthier, seeing their domestic economy stimulated, and they call it win-win cooperation. And it's a completely different economic model. Now, that's not to say there aren't Chinese companies that do bad things, because there are. That's not to say that there's not situations where you see, Chinese companies kind of trying to, maneuver countries in Africa to do their will, because that happens. But it is not the neo-colonial economic relationship that we define as imperialism. It is win-win cooperation. It's an alternative model of globalization, and that's what's coming out of China.
Okay, I'm going to mix up the order a little bit here, so please bear with me. I know how people came on, but I'm going to call on people in different order. I think I'm going to jump a little bit here and ask Laura to ask her question, and then followed by Raj. So, Laura, would you...
Can I just interject? I would like to be placed in the proper order, and I don't like being shifted around. So it takes me to think.
We'll get to you.
So I'd like to be put back after Laura, please.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Laura.
Okay. I'm really glad you mentioned Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution. And another strong thing about Hugo Chavez was that he knew that no country could stand alone in Latin America, and so the regional integration is a legacy that he left that is still powerful in helping some of the countries that fell away into neoliberalism to come back. And just thinking about I have two questions. One question has to do with the importance of staying of coalitions, of staying in alignment and stuff like that, and sort of what would be your thought about how to relate to the DSA and how to relate to, some of these others that have this influence of, the neoliberal, coming in. So that's one question. And another one is that what are the analysts and activists and people who get interviewed on the independent radio stations and stuff like that, who do you think are the best ones to listen to in terms of being on the right track? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Sure.
And thank you for a terrific presentation.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And in answer to your first question about DSA, I think DSA is a great place to meet people. I think it's a great place to find people and connect with them. But I think that the idea that we're going to, that those of us who are genuine Marxists and anti-imperialists are going to take over DSA is pure delusion. That will never happen. It's rigged. Certain people are going to be in charge of it. But to get your foot in the door and meet people, make friends, and bring them to think tanks like the Center for Political Innovation or other, anti-imperialist or Marxist groups is a possibility. And that if you go in and try to fight with them, they can use that to isolate you. So it's better, I would argue, I, as a journalist, I cannot be a member of any political organization. So I'm working with a think tank, the Center for Political Innovation, but I can't join any party or anything like that. But if I were not, I would probably join the DSA just to meet people and make friends and try to bring them to the Center for Political Innovation. And in order to do that effectively, I'd have to make sure to stay away from any attempts to, fight the leadership or form a red faction, because at the end of the day, it's not going to be successful. That's my feeling toward DSA, is go into it, meet people, make friends, and then try to bring them to anti-imperialism. As far as who to listen to, Max Blumenthal is a writer that I have absolute amazing admiration for. Ben Norton is very, very tremendous in his analysis and his work. Jimmy Dore, he's not a Marxist, I would say, but he's an anti-war activist and a progressive comedian, and the fact that he has challenged AOC in the way that he has is very effective. There was a grouping called the Fred Hampton Leftists that were around for a while. There's one of the voices out of Boston, Sabi Sobs. She's very amazing. There's a young guy named Jackson Hinkle, who's very, very good and does a lot of very, very good Marxist commentary. And there's also a TV network or a YouTube social media group called Convo Couch, and I actually arranged for them to go to Venezuela or to go to Nicaragua to be monitors of the Nicaraguan election, and they're really great folks as well. And it's this kind of layer, this alternative left that is challenging the DSA narrative that is pushing Medicare for all marches, etc. That's where I think revolutionaries need to be.
Okay, next up is Gene, followed by Raj. And people, please keep in mind, I haven't forgotten about you. We just have a pretty long stack right now. So go ahead, Gene, if you'd unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. And, thank you so much. I've heard Caleb speak before and been influenced by him. And so I have high expectations, which have been fully met. So thank you very much. And I have a question reading the manifesto, it concludes with the words, "Workers of the world unite." And Marx never said workers of England unite, nor did he say workers of America unite. It was workers of the world unite. And as we all know, the largest, best organized, and most effective working class in the world is the Chinese working class. The China Labor Union has something like over 300 million organized workers. The Communist Party has 90 million members, which are overwhelmingly supported by the workers of China. And further, in terms of effective, basically the average wage of workers in China have increased almost eightfold since the revolution. And so this is a situation about the most effective working class in the world, yet DSA and other left organizations in the world seem to support are opposed to the policies of the Communist Party of China, and also actively support pro-imperialist attacks such as those of supporting the so-called pro-democracy CIA-funded people in Hong Kong. So I'd just like you to comment on the question of our relationship to the Communist Party of China. and in general, politically. I know DSA is not very pleased with China. So anyway, I look forward to what you have to say on this.
Well, my answer is going to be very brief, but I would just say that we should look to the Chinese Communist Party with admiration for all that they've achieved and for the role that they're playing in raising people out of poverty in China and fighting for the working people of China and improving their conditions. We should also look to the Chinese Communist Party, as in admiration for what it's done around the world. That doesn't mean we should never criticize them or be aware of some of the problems in China with human rights, with corruption, etc. But the main thing is that the Chinese don't want to export their system to the United States or any country around the world. They call their system socialism with Chinese characteristics. Because they are very aware of the fact that that it is specifically designed for China. And when we do have socialism in the United States, it won't be Russian socialism or Korean socialism or Chinese socialism or Venezuelan socialism. It's going to be a model unique to the United States, designed to address the contradictions of U.S. society. And we need to be aware of that. And that while we can look to China for inspiration, we should study it. We have to recognize that when we build socialism here, it's going to be different. I've provocatively used the term socialism with American characteristics many times, and that's gotten me a lot of blowback. People get upset that I say that, but I'm just emphasizing the fact that just like China's socialism is unique to China, our socialism in the United States will be unique to the United States. So that's my comment on that.
Yeah. Sometimes I refer to it as Bernie-style socialism, being a strong supporter of both Bernie and AOC, as well as PSL. And Blair LaRiva. So, thank you.
Okay, next up is Raj, followed by Rich, Norma, and Yusuf. And I'm going to put myself at the end of the stack. So, go ahead, Raj. You're unmuted. You can ask your question, make your comment.
Thank you, Caleb. I think you did a tremendous job of summarizing the history of revolutions and history of Marxism, and you brought it to the current stage. But while I agree with you that tactics should be changed, but you cannot defend capitalism as socialism. This is where I think there is a mistake on your part, in my opinion. What is happening in China is tremendous development of capitalism. It's run by the Communist Party, no doubt about it. The Communist Party has an enormous history and is very well organized party, okay? And so therefore, it is being run, like you described, for development of economy. So I would say even under Lenin, you're familiar with left-wing communism, an infantile disorder, which was his answer to the left communist, German left communist, who said Lenin's taking, when he had new economic policy, that Lenin's taking Russia back to capitalism. But Lenin, in that said, he's not going to keep it. This is going to be very brief. Now in China, I thought that's what they were doing, okay? And I tremendously supported that. Okay, you should be able to do that. Okay, in Russia it was 7.5 years. In China I gave them 15 years, maybe 22.5 years. But now it's over 30 years. And what has developed is that 2/3 of the people, if not 3/4, are working for private companies. Now, you have the impossible argument here that workers like to be exploited by private companies, and they support a party that allows them to be exploited. Well, that means they are no longer revolutionary workers. And party membership, if you go by party membership, in India, the BJP, Right of Center Party, is 180 million people as members. It doesn't mean anything. Who are these people? Are they the proletarians? In Russia, under Lenin, they were proletarians. The party represented the spirit of the proletarians, and they were the highest. That is not true of China today. So, I agree with you. The greatest, United States is in actual imperialist stage that Lenin described, the rotten stage of capital. China is not. Still has potential to grow. But Lenin also, when he described Germany Germany and Japan and the United States are these. He said they are the fastest growing economies. Okay, and they're outstripping the older capitalist countries like Britain and France, etc. But he did not draw the lesson that something. He did not change the thing about characteristic. Whenever you start attaching characteristics, I think you're fooling people, in my opinion. You have to come out, call a spade a spade. Capitalism is developing, is run by the Communist Party, which is caught in its contradictions now. Belt and Road is the way for them to somehow expand their investment elsewhere. So how do you answer that? And by the way, we're on the same side. I'm not saying this as an attack. I just want you to explain your position. How do you challenge this theory? Because you're contradicting the theory, in my opinion.
Sure. Well, I would point you toward the critique of the Goethe program. And this is, this very important document written by Marx to explain the nature of socialism, critiquing the, one of the founding documents of the German Social Democratic Party. And in that, he talks about, the goal of socialism, the difference between the higher phase of communism and the lower stage. And he writes, in a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. And what Marx is pointing out is that you cannot build an egalitarian society in poverty. That the basis for uprooting class society, the basis for uprooting inequality, the basis for the withering away of the state is abundance. And during the Cold War, this understanding that socialism is, really only capable of fulfilling its objectives by eradicating scarcity was lost. And this was one of the errors of Stalin. In the final years of Stalin's life, they said that the Soviet Union was entering the early stages of communism. That's in William Z. Foster's Twilight of World Capitalism. Well, that's not true. The Soviet Union at that point was nowhere near the level that the Western capitalist countries were at in terms of productive forces. And Che Guevara, his work, Socialism and Man in Cuba, where he argued that they shouldn't use material incentives in Cuba. And eventually the Cultural Revolution in China, which was disastrous, and then Pol Pot in Cambodia, who said they could have socialism in Cambodia on the basis of an agrarian economy without industry. The notion of the Gang of Four in China, that you can achieve a higher stage in poverty, this is all a departure from that. That the point of socialism is to have the means of production rationally operated to overcome the problem of the tendency of the falling rate of profit and the irrational capitalist production motive and overproduction, to rationally organize the economy to create abundance through which then inequalities can break down. That is the understanding, and that that China, yes, they have raised 800 million people out of poverty, but some of those 800 million were raised out of poverty in just the last couple of years. And that the basis for breaking down inequality, the basis for eradicating the inequality between the capitalist and the worker, the basis for building an egalitarian society is vast abundance. And that trying to create an egalitarian society in poverty, we've learned throughout the Cold War, was a recipe for disaster. And I think that is the focus of the Chinese Communist Party right now, is creating abundance. And that has led, as you were right to point out, to a lot of inequality, and it has led to a lot of I guess I would say not just inequality, but also a lot of corruption. And that China is now dealing with the fact that they've created this capitalist class that they created. There would not be this vast capitalist class in China if the Communist Party had not made the decision to create it. But yet, like Frankenstein's monster, they rise off the slab and attack them. The capitalist class in China is hostile to the Chinese Communist Party. And so now we see President Xi Jinping waging a campaign to try and correct this, because they recognize this, and that this is kind of a contradiction that has developed. But I think at the end of the day, that knowledge that socialism can't be built on the basis of scarcity, it requires abundance and economic development. I think that's the basis for how the Chinese Communist Party is currently operating. And that's why we've seen this prolonged market reform taking place. But at the end of the day, the party is still in charge. So I would not call it capitalism. But I understand your perspective.
Okay, next up is Rich, followed by Norma. If you guys could keep your questions down to about 2 minutes. We have a pretty long group of people who want to ask questions. So, Rich, if you would unmute and ask your question, followed by Norma, followed by Yusuf.
Okay, yeah. So as oftentimes recently, rich means rich in kit. In this case, it means kit. Now, I had a question that I was going to ask just to be on the tail of her part, which I've already forgotten and might remember. So as she ends, I might jump in on the same moment after she's finished. But this is Kit.
Hi, Caleb. Thank you very much for speaking. Very impressive to hear you talk. You've got a great memory and wealth of information. I think a lot of young people need to have these days. Anyway, my question has to do with Occupy, since that's where you came out of, and I'd like to know, how you came to your views today, and also, not everyone in Occupy obviously thinks like you do. So you come here with some really interesting, you've developed in a very interesting way. Also, I'd like your assessment of what went wrong, or where things went with Occupy, why it couldn't sustain itself. And also, are you aware of the, in the state legislature of California, the California Care is being discussed, and what are your views on that? Thank you.
Sure. Well, as far as my own development, I grew up in a very small town in Ohio. I'm actually from Orrville, Ohio, which is the town where Smucker's jelly is manufactured. So if you eat Smucker's, it's coming from my hometown in Ohio. It was a very Republican, conservative town. But my father, he was an environmentalist. He worked for a nonprofit, a land conservation nonprofit, and he had a side gig running nature tours in the Galapagos Islands. So when I was 12 years old, I went to Ecuador with my dad, and it was 1999, and Ecuador was in the middle of a man-made famine created by neoliberalism. And we got off the plane, and we saw crowds full of desperately poor, starving people. Hundreds of thousands of people died of malnutrition in Ecuador in the late 90s because of neoliberalism and free market capitalism and such. And I saw that. And I'd never seen that level of poverty before, and that certainly had an impact on my development. My mother was a librarian, and she went on strike when I was a fourth grader, and I walked the picket lines with my mom, and I got an understanding and a respect for the labor movement. My parents really liked folk music, and they liked, Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and stuff, so that also influenced me that way as well. And when I got to college, I got interested in communist groups, and, I got involved with a couple different communist groups when I was in college. I moved to New York City around the time of Occupy Wall Street, and I participated in the Occupy Wall Street protests, and I started giving commentary on RT and on Press TV and other international TV networks. The problems with Occupy, as far as that, Occupy Wall Street was it's kind of sad, but if you'll remember, after Obama got elected, the Tea Party, and the lower level capitalists, the fracking companies, and the Koch brothers were just kicking his ass. They were after him. I mean, they were not letting him do anything. The healthcare reform, the public, they were after him. And the Democrats realized that if they were going to, if the Democrats who kind of represented, you had, Warren Buffett and Soros and the Rockefellers and some of the wealthier capitalists that wanted to stabilize the economy with some social democratic measures, but not even really that, just some stabilization of the economy, that if they were going to get anything done, they needed to have their own movement in the streets. And they went to some of the communist groups. I mean, it's kind of sad, but there was the occupation of the factory in Chicago, the Republic Window and Door Makers strike that was a successful victory, and there was an attempt to kind of revitalize the labor movement a little bit. There was the Bail Out the People movement that was formed, that was organizing demonstrations, bail out the people, not the banks. Michael Moore made that movie, Capitalism, A Love Story. You had Jon Stewart of The Daily Show. He did this rally to restore sanity that was kind of a demonstration in D.C. against the Tea Party. None of that was working. The ruling class was needing some, the capitalists that were in alliance with Obama were needing some energy in the street to push back against the Republicans, and they were hoping to kind of use the traditional left forces to do it, and they were just so weak they couldn't pull it off. So, seeing that, I was there and I saw it. There's this professor, his name is escaping me. He actually recently died, but he was part of the anti-globalization, David Graeber, and he was part of the anti-globalization protests in Europe. And he brought over some forces from Spain and Greece and Eastern Europe, and some forces that had been involved in the efforts to overthrow Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia, Otpor, and they built the Occupy movement, and they had the support of mainstream media and a lot of sections of mainstream society, kind of making it blow up as the Democrats push back against the Republicans. But it was great because it was a moment that a lot of people, it's kind of like what I was saying about DSA before, a lot of people had never heard an anti-capitalist message, the 99% and the 1%. And so a lot of people, that was the first political activism they did. And it was a great place to meet people and win them over and recruit them. But at the end of the day, it wasn't like the Marxists and the revolutionaries were never going to take over Occupy Wall Street. It was started by these forces that were around David Graeber, that were around Open Society Institute, George Soros, the Otpor movement from former Yugoslavia, etc. But it was a great place to meet people, and the message of the 99% and the 1% really hit home. And I noticed that even though that was, the rallying cry of Occupy at the beginning, you'll notice it was attacked immediately by identity politics forces. That 99% and 1%, that was immediately declared to be just a crime by a lot of these academic leftists, because that's the last thing that these academic forces want. They want intersectionality. They want privileged politics and oppression theory. There was a great expose by Christian Parenti recently, the son of Michael Parenti, of this workshop, this privilege walk workshop that is done in a lot of progressive spaces now. It was actually invented by Harvey Jackins, who was a founder of the Church of Scientology, or of Dianetics, which is a precursor to Scientology, who was kicked out for being a leftist, and he started reevaluation counseling or co-counseling. This is cult brainwashing. It's an exercise that is done in these, we talk about woke shops. It's an exercise that is done to kind of reinforce this anti-solidarity message, this kind of liberal woke message, that the answer to racism is the picket line, bringing working people together to see that they have a common interest against the capitalists, putting the needs of oppressed people first, and understanding that by putting the needs of the oppressed first, the whole working class can advance, as was done in San Francisco, where the dock workers in 1934 demanded in their strike that black workers be hired to work on the docks, and they put the needs of the black people at the front of the struggle of the dock workers, and they won a victory for all of the workers of San Francisco, right? That's the Marxist approach to the question of racial oppression, to the question of gender oppression, etc. But pushing this woke message where it's about emphasizing how some workers have it too good and need to feel guilty about it, which is a very divisive message that it serves a different purpose. And that was an attempt to push back against. Probably the best thing about Occupy Wall Street was that it got a lot of people in motion, number one. And number two, with their 99% and 1%, it introduced the idea that all of the 99% have a common interest against the international capitalist monopolies. So, Occupy was a good moment, but at the same time, it was a good place to meet people, and that genuine revolutionary forces need to use these kind of mobilizations and uprisings to recruit at the end of the day and build up our own forces so that we can mobilize the masses to eventually take power.
Okay, that sounds great. Do you want to comment on about the California Care in California?
Sure.
Trying to do there?
Yeah, I support that. The demand for Medicare, for all, and on a statewide basis. In New York, there's proposals around it. I think it's tremendous, and I think it's a great thing. And that mobilizing around this very, very progressive demand, the right to health care for working people, even if it's only on a statewide level, is a great place to meet people that are progressive and would be open to our message. And it's also a demand that would advance. If this could be won, that would inspire people to get involved in activism. They can see that there's an actual victory that's been won, then more people will want to get involved in political activism. So yeah, I think it's tremendous.
Okay, thank you. Rich, if you have a quick question, we'd like to, we have a lot of people on the stack. We want to keep questions on the short side. Go ahead.
Alan, let's let me pass. Take my name down and my hand down, and if I remember my question, whatever, I'll bring it back up. But I'd rather let it go. It took a fair amount of time. But, good answers.
Good, I remember my question.
I don't need
Okay, thank you, Rich. Next up is Norma. If you'd ask your question, go ahead.
Hi. Well, I enjoyed that. That was lovely, Caleb. And I know many of us did. It fits our ideas here on this show. I went to an educational, I was going to the educationals that DSA was doing in the area, and in one discussion I mentioned that Stalin was the great defender of the revolution, and there was absolute silence. there was not even any kind of outrage expressed, let alone any support. So, do you have any impression about Grover Furr? I'd like to know what you think about him, if you do.
Sure. Well, I've met Grover Furr many times. I mean, we've had coffee together, and I actually years ago I went out to Montclair State where he teaches, and I was working with some of his students. We organized some demonstrations against the lies about North Korea and such. So, you know, I have great admiration for Grover Furr. He's a really a great person. Honestly, I am not enough of a historian to vouch for everything that he's ever written, but I think by far his greatest work is the book Blood Lies, which rips to shreds Timothy Snyder, and just shows that Timothy Snyder's writing on the Soviet Union is pure anti-Russian propaganda and academic fraud. And I always recommend, when people ask me what books by Grover Furr do I recommend, by far his crowning achievement, his magnum opus, is the book Blood Lies.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next up is Yusuf, followed by Sharon. Go ahead, Yusuf, if you would.
Okay, one concern I had was in the beginning, you made it as if everything reinvents itself ex nihilo, and whereas in dialectics, the synthesis is a product of the previous thesis and antithesis. So there's continuity, and this is in line with science, where I come from, where actually we don't trash Newton or Einstein or quantum mechanics because there's string theory. Well, anyway, that's proven yet. And in fact, for a whole year, we give grueling Newtonian mechanics to freshmen. So, freshman students. So, there is continuity, and I'm concerned that such discourse is often used to do away with Marxism and replace it with class collaboration. Second, I don't quite understand what you mean by being on the forces of order at the end of your talk.
Sure. My answer to the first question is you're absolutely right. I remember when I was first reading Marxist books in the early, 2001, 2002, I was looking for Marxist books. I found a million books that were ranting against the old dogmatic hardline communism. And I could never find any books that were actually representing the old hardline dogmatic communism that every book by every liberal academic and every, post-Soviet, intellectual was written until I found the writings of William Z. Foster. And I read The History of the Three Internationals, and I read Toward Soviet America, and I loved, and I found that old dogmatic pro-Soviet line to be much more coherent and clear and offer much more answers than the kind of the postmodern academic world, and that in a lot of times in the name of anti-dogmatism, these forces that are genuinely, rejecting Marxism, rejecting historical progress, they will hijack it. But that said, the world is still in motion, and we are building, like you said with Newton, we don't throw out Newton, but we recognize that Einstein, in a lot of ways, improved upon Newton and developed things in a different way, and we should study all of it. I encourage people You know, I mean, the history of the new communist movement. You know, there's a great book, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. There's a great book, Revolution in the Air by Max Elbaum. There's a couple good histories of the Revolutionary Communist Party and how the FBI infiltrated them in the 1970s that have been published. There's a lot written about the 1930s, and I consume that vigorously because we have to learn what happened before if we're going to figure out how to do it. And one of the worst things, and Yusuf, I sympathize with you completely, one of my biggest pet peeves is revisionists who do not know what it is they are revising. When I was working with students years ago, there was an attempt to form a new Students for a Democratic Society, a new SDS. And I encountered a number of people who said they didn't want to join SDS because SDS was a, quote, sexist group. And it's like they got the critique of SDS made by feminists because there was a big problem with the way women were treated in the organization, no doubt. But they never learned the good part. They never learned that SDS was the group that shut down Columbia University in 1968, that organized these huge demonstrations. They had just heard the postmodern critique of SDS, and so they were following that, but they never learned the good part. And that there's a lot of that, you know, the revisionists who do not know what they revise. If you're going to get up and say we need to move away or we need to challenge some old assumptions, you must know that assumption very thoroughly in order to do it. And that is very important. And that we should know, you know, we should know the old-time Marxism better than anybody else as we build upon it. And that is really important. Now, as far as the second part of your question about why it is that we're the bringers of order, you know, the desire for chaos is the French Revolution in a lot of ways. You know, the peasantry of France. I mean, the way they were supposed to live, or they couldn't even look a noble in the face. There were different words they would use for you or me or whatever when speaking to someone of a higher caste, and the amount of control that it was exerted over the peasantry and such. And you can look at the French Revolution as just an explosion of rage, executions, and also an explosion of sexual release. And that in a lot of ways the aesthetics of the left coming out of the struggle to bring down feudalism are the aesthetics of release, right? We're going to give people permission to unleash their anger, give people permission to unleash their rage, give people permission to feel their resentment, give people permission to unleash their sexual desires. And that was largely what the bourgeoisie fomented to bring down feudalism. However, if you look at the strength of Russia and the Soviet Union, if you look at the strength of China, if you look at the strength of modern Cuba, it's not that they gave people permission to unleash their rage, it's the opposite. It's that they built a feeling of community. They stabilized the country. They raised people out of poverty. They provided a level of economic security. And that nowadays the revolutionary intelligentsia and the middle class, elements that are tied to the Democratic Party have kind of hijacked those Che Guevara aesthetics. Wherever there's a CIA color revolution, and this makes me very angry as someone who was very proud to be part of Occupy Wall Street, you will always see that Guy Fawkes mask from the movie V for Vendetta at those protests, right? V for Vendetta is a great movie. It ends with, the parliament exploding, and it's this righteous release of rage. But the broad masses of people, not the revolutionary intelligentsia, but the broad masses of people, largely they're not looking for an explosion of rage. They're not looking for chaos. They're not looking for libidinal release. They're looking for the opposite. Capitalism has made their life unstable, and they want their life to be stable. They want a job. They want health care. They want education. Capitalism is tearing their community apart. They want peace in their community. And that's why it's very important that we never advocate violence or violent revolution. It's one thing to recognize that working people in their process of building a movement for justice may be threatened and have to defend themselves and may at some point have no choice but to take up arms. That's one thing. But if we go around advocating a violent revolution, advocating like we want the country to be torn up by some big civil war, we're only going to alienate ourselves because working people don't want their communities and their country to be torn up by civil war. They want stability. And we, peace, land, and bread was the demands of the Russian Revolution. That was stability. We will offer you peace. We will offer you land. We will offer you bread. And that the demands of working people, of the broad masses, tend to be demands for making society more stable and getting rid of the chaos flowing from capitalism and decay.
Okay, next is Sharon, followed by Roger, and then I have a question. I think we're going to wrap it up for questions after the three of us. So go ahead, Sharon, if you would unmute.
Thank you, Callum, very much. I just have a couple of historical comments or comments about some of the historical things that you mentioned. first of all, I think that your talk omitted touching on the role of the Communist Party in the 1930s, which was extremely important. And I think we need to learn from the history of the Communist Party coming out of the Second World War, and we need to know what happened to the base that it had built up in the 30s, and what mistakes might have been made in response to McCarthyism and the execution of the Rosenbergs. And I think that's something that needs much more study. You mentioned that Lenin said that the colonial countries, or the people of the colonial world, were the ones who were going to rise up. And I think that's true that he said that, but he was convinced of that by the likes of Ho Chi Minh. And he didn't originally think that. I don't believe it at first. Because I think most Marxists at the turn of the century thought that, it was in the metropolitan areas, it was in the most developed capitalist countries that revolution would first arise. And then finally, I think that Marxists or revolutionaries need to be everywhere. I never fault anyone for being in the Democratic Party. I want to know what they're doing there. I want to know what they think, but I don't think it's wrong to be in whatever organizations, including Occupy. But I would point out that your experience in Occupy in New York was, I believe, very different from what was going on in Oakland and the other places on the West Coast. And Occupy in Oakland was organized and led by anarchists, ideological anarchists. And I tried to relate to them up close and personal and talk to them about having some concrete demands, for example, instead of just saying, down with everything. But I think you're right. I mean, I think we should ask ourselves, how come we didn't think of 1% versus the 99%? Because that was a really important, I think that's still an important concept that was promoted by Occupy. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'll answer, that when, Laura Wells asked, who the old hardline author I mentioned, that's William Z. Foster, the leader of the Communist Party of the United States during the 1930s and 40s and up into the 50s. And he's probably been the person who I have studied the most. His 5 history volumes that he wrote in the 1950s, the history of the Communist Party, the history of black people in America, the history of the labor movement, the history of the 3 internationals, the history of the World Trade Union movement. These are really important books, and his, Twilight of World Capitalism and his Toward Soviet America, these are pivotal works, and I think they absolutely need to be studied. When you talk about the 1930s, one of the most common historical distortions that I hear nowadays is the Popular Front. The Popular Front, Roosevelt entered an alliance with the Communist Party in the face of fascism. That's true, and it was great, and it was necessary. But there are 2 factors that are missing when people use that to say we should now support the Democrats. And the first thing is that the Communist Party, first, before the Popular Front, they spent, 5-6 years building mass movements of working people and, building up a base in working class communities, building up labor unions that were aligned with them, with the Trade Union Unity League, and they represented hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So Roosevelt wasn't entering an alliance with a very small sect. He was entering an alliance with a real force. Plus, the Soviet Union existed, and the Communist Party was aligned with it. So him aligning with the Communist Party in the U.S. had geopolitical implications. He was aligning with a fifth of the planet, the Soviet Union. So people who say now, oh, well, we have to support the Democrats don't owe us anything if we align with them. They don't have to give us anything, right? Joe Biden's not sitting there and going, oh boy, I really hope the Communist Party USA endorses me. I better appoint one of them to my cabinet. He's not doing that. It's not that kind of situation, right? And that's a distortion. And I think that's what's missing, is that if you enter an alliance without anything to bring to the table, without the ability to push and pull, you're not, at the end of the day, going to have very much influence over that alliance. And I think that's one of the biggest distortions. As far as the 1950s, I think that, the Browderism, Earl Browder, remember he dissolved the Communist Party during World War II, created the Communist Political Association, and that Earl Browder kind of took the support for Roosevelt in a very liberal direction, to the point that he wanted to end strikes permanently after World War II, and that as McCarthyism set in, there was, from what I understand, there was a feeling among a lot of Communist Party organizers. They couldn't understand why it was happening. They thought, we've done so much for the Democrats. Why would they do this to us? And there was kind of a level of denial about that the whole Roosevelt coalition wasn't good. That yes, Henry Wallace was pretty good, and yes, there were a lot of progressives, but there were a lot of people in the Roosevelt coalition who weren't their friends, and there was kind of there was not an understanding that endorsing Roosevelt was a tactic. I remember when I was a kid, I wanted to get a movie, a VHS tape. I wanted to watch a movie about communists, and so I watched The Way We Were with Barbara Streisand, and I was perplexed by it. I just sat there and went, huh? Because there's a scene in the movie where Roosevelt has died, and Barbara Streisand, who's this communist, is crying, and she's just so upset. And I remember thinking, what in the world is that? It made zero sense to me. Well, I didn't know about the Popular Front, and I didn't know about Earl Browder, and I didn't know about all of that. And I'm all for nostalgia about Roosevelt, but I think that the Communist Party at some points didn't scientifically analyze him. They fell into kind of just worshiping Roosevelt, and so they weren't prepared for the ultimate, result, which was when the Roosevelt coalition broke apart, many people that were in it turning against them. And I think that was part of the problem there. And as far as Occupy, I know on the West Coast, the ideological anarchist current is much stronger. The anarchists here on the East Coast are not as ideological, and that, I encountered them in Oakland. Just covering the demonstrations was very difficult. I wasn't there. People accused me of being a police officer. I had to pull out, it was, there's a lot of paranoia and destructive thinking, and some of that probably flows from the new left of California, the hippie days, and the, Haight-Ashbury and all of that. And I think this is their descendants. In a lot of cases, this is their kids, right? These are the children of the new left, right? The people that were, with the Hare Krishnas or whatever in the 1960s. This is their children, and they're kind of the next generation that's much more pessimistic. But regardless, the problem of no demands was a big problem at Occupy here in New York. And again, my feeling about Occupy is the same as DSA. It's a great place to recruit. But we fell into the illusion, the communist group I was with, that we were going to somehow take over, or we were going to be the ones to push them to make this demand. That was never going to happen. From day one, Occupy would never have been allowed to happen if there weren't forces like, George Soros, forces tied to the Democratic Party who approved it. Nancy Pelosi said she supported Occupy Wall Street, and it was from the top. It was approved. It was given, there was somebody in government offices who gave it a check mark and said, okay, we can allow this to happen. So because of that, we shouldn't fall into the trap of trying to take over their spaces. But we shouldn't isolate ourselves. If you went into Occupy determined to fight against the leadership, they could very easily isolate you. So, but if you just went in and found good people and met them and then grouped them around yourself, that's how you could gain it. And I will say a lot of people that I know became communists at Occupy. They heard about a protest on MSNBC on Rachel Maddow. They went down there, and somebody sold them a newspaper, and somebody gave them a pamphlet, and then they came to a meeting. And a lot of the people that I knew who are now active in communist groups, and they got active because of Occupy, and that should have been the focus. During the third period or the early 1930s, the Communist Party, they talked about a united front from below. Meaning they weren't going to try to combat the leaders of the AFL union. Instead, they were going to try to recruit the rank and file. And sometimes that may be the best approach in dealing with social democracy and DSA and other forces is try to recruit the rank and file, not try to confront or enter a united front with the leaders at the top, because their orientation is to be hostile. That's my experience.
Okay, next question is Roger. If you would ask your question, then I'm going to go, and I think we're going to wrap up.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Caleb. It was a very good presentation, and I think it particularly good for the Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library, a very appropriate thing. We met briefly in Nicaragua in November.
Oh, great.
On the election observation. It's kind of late in the day right now for us, and we've kind of facing a bit of mental fatigue. So I'm going to ask them really easy stuff, not big political questions as I often do. But I'm a biologist by training. So my first question has to do with this. Should be an easy question. Is and I've led Galapagos tours. Who did your father work for?
Well, my father ran a.
You're muted.
Oh. My father was the director of an environmental nonprofit in Ohio called the Wilderness Center, and they organized trips to the Galapagos Islands that my father was working with.
And then the other one was, in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about human history, and you described it as to understand human history properly, you have to understand it dialectically, that A does not equal A. And you contrasted it to the natural world where, beavers always build beaver dams the same. I would suggest that the Marxist view is that nature also is dialectical, and that beavers, and I can argue that beavers do evolve. In fact, if A always equaled A, we wouldn't have evolution. And I would recommend a book by two Marxists. Let me see if we can get this up here. No, it's not focusing. It's a mostly reviewed press book. It came out in 2007. It's by Richard Lowenthal and Richard Levins. I don't know if you know them. They're Marxist biologists from Harvard. And they wrote this book called Biology Under the Influence. And it's a very good, I think it would be the standard one for biology, understanding the biology of Marxism, and understanding that nature too has its, the laws of dialectics relate to animal societies as well as human. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask the last question before we end this part of today's presentation. One of the things that I've noticed is that you're very active on the internet, on YouTube discussions, and you have one yourself, which, by the way, people really want to ask further questions. Caleb is very accessible. You just have to sign up for his YouTube channel, and he takes questions and has very open-ended discussion of things. But what I'd like you to comment on is, in your experience in interacting with lots of different, especially younger people, on internet, social media-based platforms, what do you think is the benefit? What are some of your observations about this in terms of the future development of the movement? Do you think it's valuable? What have you been seeing, and what do you think it reflects in terms of the state of the movement?
Well, one thing that I have observed, and this will be the focus of my remarks closing as we got to finish, but is that that for a lot of the younger people online who are listening to Marxist podcasts or YouTube videos, there is no understanding of building an organization. They've never been part of it. They've never been in a time where there were big mass movements of people organizing. They've never been in a Marxist party. And that it doesn't occur to them, right? The idea that this could go beyond simply discussions, and we could actually build a community of activists who give the whole of their lives to this struggle, is something they're not familiar with. And some of these forces, I think they just don't know. Jackson Hinkle is a friend of mine and all of that, and I am hoping to inspire him to do more building of an organization. But he's a young guy, and he just has never been part of that. He's run for office before, but other than that, but it's just like the idea that you might just be an internet entertainer and commentator is something that a lot of people in these communities, that's all they know, is that, oh, okay, I can listen to this, I can hear these ideas, and I can be entertained by it. But no, it's more than just passive entertainment. It's about giving your life to this. It's about building a group. So for them, for a lot of people, I think they just don't know. But then for some of these forces, there's this podcast that's associated with Democratic Socialists of America, Chapo Trap House, that has hundreds of thousands of people listening to it. Could you imagine how different this country would be if that was more than a podcast? If they were calling demonstrations of people, they were organizing these people into a group, things would be very different. And the same goes for, ContraPoints and Bosch and the BreadTube community. they have millions of people listening to them, and they don't mobilize them. Or if they do mobilize them, it's to vote for Joe Biden. And it raises a question: if this is just kind of passive entertainment and analysis, what purpose is it serving? The slogan that you guys use, right? That philosophers have only analyzed the world, but the point, however, is to change it. That is the main thing that is missing in a lot of the internet Marxist spaces. And we have to realize we're never going to be able to out-whiz-bang the ruling class. They are always going to have better production values than us. They're always going to have better, they're always going to be able to offer a better entertainment product than we are, okay? At the end of the day. However, what makes us different, the way that we will prove ourselves, is what Lenin said in Imperialism and the Split in Socialism. If we wish to remain socialists, we must go lower and deeper to the real masses. Bring the broad masses of people into an organization that gets things done. That's what we've got on them. And that's what the fake socialists... I mean, DSA... I like to joke that the DSA is like the winter coat of the capitalist class. They don't want to wear it, but if it gets too cold, they get it out of the closet and they put it on. Right? When I was first organizing protests against the Iraq War, people didn't even know that DSA existed. DSA's name would be on the demonstration. People were like, are they still around? It was like this. People said, well, it's a banquet once a year for labor leaders. But now that capitalism is in a crisis and there's divisions in the ruling class, suddenly DSA is everywhere. And, in the 80s, when there was a big Marxist movement, it was declining, the In These Times magazine was everywhere. And, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee and Michael Harrington, they were everywhere. And that when there's a need for them, the ruling class takes their winter coat out of their closet and suddenly they have a DSA. But then, when there's not a need for them, they put them away and they don't need them, right? And that's kind of the role these social democratic forces play. They're there when the bourgeoisie needs them to try and control the upsurge of the masses. But we need to be there all the time, right? And we need to not be, trying to manage, spontaneous sentiments that are already there and control them, but rather give voice and give voice to the feelings among the broad masses, build real communities of solidarity that are a force to be contended with, and that's the way we can defeat them. So that's my analysis of a lot of the internet Marxism that goes on these days.
Thank you. If you want to go ahead and make some closing remarks, go ahead.
Well, I guess I will just close my remarks by reading a passage from Karl Marx that I've always found to be very inspiring. It's towards the end of his pamphlet, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And he concludes the essay, let me just pull it up here, the quotation. All right. All right. And I think it applies to our situation very, very well. Let me just pull it up here. 18th Brumaire. Thank you for your patience.
While you're working on that, I'd like to give you a sentence from one of the people that we work with, Mehmet, who is from Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
He explained to us, or to me in particular, that the work is from the bottom and the top. That is, Venezuela developed what it did because the people made Hugo Chavez as which is different from the other way around. That the political control definitely relates to the bottom organizing, and this is so important for us to hold on to as we work on these projects.
Absolutely. All right. This is how I will conclude. This is Marx writing in 1851. He writes, "The proletarian revolutions, like those of the 19th century, constantly criticize themselves, constantly interrupt themselves in their own course, return to the apparently accomplished in order to begin anew. They deride with cruel thoroughness the half-measures, weaknesses, and paltriness of their first attempts. They seem to throw down their opponents, only so the latter may draw new strength from the earth and rise before them, again more gigantic than ever, recoil constantly from the indefinite colossalness of their own goals, until a situation is created which makes all turning back impossible, and conditions themselves call out, "Here's the rose, now dance." So, yes.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Caleb. We really appreciate your taking the time to speak to us. This was a terrific session. Your presentation was rich in content, a breath of fresh air. I wanted to thank everybody who asked questions. I thought the quality of the questions were excellent. Your responses were excellent. At this point, what we're going to do is we're just going to cut off the recording